Slavery and anti-slavery. And one of the reasons I wanted this particular chapter split off from chapter 11 was because, number one, chapter 11 was rather lengthy in the lecture, and slavery is a very touchy subject no matter who you are or where you talk about it. So I wanted it to be totally separate so we could maybe get some kind of an understanding for you. According to your text, the first settlement in Kentucky, Fort Herod, back in 1777, had 19 slaves, and that's out of a very small population. But by 1790, right before we became a state, 16.2% of our population was slaves. 2% was free. 0.02% was free, I'm sorry. By 1830, 24% of our population was slaves, but it's starting to fall off a little bit. As you can see, by 1860, right before the Civil War, we had 19.5% of the population was slaves. Of that, 225,000 plus is what 19% is. 0.9% of free blacks. Free blacks were not welcomed anywhere in Kentucky or any place else in the South because, well, it might give your slave an idea that he could be free. But that 0.9% that was free was usually what we call talented or people who knew a craft, because as crazy as it seems, you can't keep your slaves busy all the time. So if you had a slave who was very good at making boots or making saddles or could cut hair or do something crafty, you would let him go to town and work for money. Of course, you wanted the money, most of it anyway. A lot of slaves managed to buy their freedom this way, but it would only be a very small percentage. And then, of course, there were some blacks who had never been slaves or who had managed to buy their freedom. But we had over 225,000, which is 250,000 folks. So why the decrease between 1830 and 1860? As I said, it's continuing to go down, primarily because, as your text pointed out, here in Kentucky, we didn't have such labor-intensive crops like they did in the Deep South. We didn't have the sugar cane and all the other stuff that needed a lot of work. We had very little tobacco, this type thing. So why didn't more people own slaves in Kentucky? The primary reason was cost, because in the 1700s, it cost from $400 to $700 to own one slave, and believe me, folks, back in those days, if you made $300 a year, you were living high on the hog. Why didn't some others own it? Because they didn't believe in slavery. They didn't believe in holding someone in bondage. Maybe they believed in slavery, but not enslaving blacks. But for the most part, most of Kentucky was, as I said, they didn't have slaves. But by 1850, out of a population of 761,000, only 5% owned slaves. So out of 139,000 families that owned slaves, it came up to 28% of the population of being in slavery. Of the 28% who owned slaves, they only owned one or more. 24% of the people who owned slaves only owned one slave. And that was usually a very poor family who couldn't afford help. But the average slaveholder in Kentucky owned 5.4 slaves. I've often wondered what part of the body that 0.4 was. But it was usually a family, a husband and a wife and their children. And they lived close. They lived very close. And of the counties that we have in Kentucky, only 23 actually had slave populations. And I have listed there, like in western Kentucky, you've got the Bluegrass, Henderson, and Oldham County in Ohio, and Ohio County. They have slaves. But the central Kentucky, the Bluegrass, is where the largest percentage was. And like I said, even Kentuckians, most Kentuckians had no ownership of slaves or even in contact with slaves. Some people went their whole lives and never saw a black person. But slaves were considered chattel. Chattel means you're being owned by someone else. And of course, women are considered chattel also. Now, yes, we had slave codes. They had the first slave codes way back in the 1700s. And they were meant to regulate the behavior of the slave. They were not necessarily meant to protect the slave. Now, did you read the awful stories of the terrible treatment of slaves? And did it happen? Yes. Was it the custom? No. Some bad slave owners, I mean, they hated the world and they hated black people, and they would burn them if they could, or they would beat them, and there's stories of it in your text. But for the most part, a slave owner was nothing more than a businessman. and he bought the slave to have labor because his family probably wasn't large enough. Or if he had 1,000 acres, one or two people can't take care of 1,000 acres. In the beginning, we tried to get the Indians to work for us, and of course, they just disappear into the forest because farming to them was a woman's job, not a man's job. You couldn't hire another man. I mean, why would another white man work for you on your farm when he could get 100 acres himself? He needed help. Families were small. It was a young country. Children were young. You had to have help. And the slave, well, he was a win-win situation because you bought him, you owned him for life. He couldn't run away. His skin color would make him stand out no matter where he went. He, a lot of times, didn't understand the language. And in our Black History class, we read a book about a slave owner whose slave ran away. He was gone for 2 weeks, and he never got more than a half a mile from a plantation because he couldn't read, he couldn't write, he didn't know north from south. He just knew there was a town somewhere over there, and he never could find it. So this is one of the reasons we tried to keep the slaves ignorant, so they didn't know which way to go. But for the most part, if you were to go out and buy a John Deere tractor to help you plow, and you go out one morning and the tractor wouldn't start, are you going to slash the tires and destroy the machine because it won't work? No, you've paid good money for that tractor. You would try to find out why it wouldn't start. So if you paid good money for the slave to work, you're not going to mistreat him so he can't work. I mean, you want to punish him and you want him to know that you're the boss, but you're not going to do something so horrible to him that he can't work the next day. You'd be throwing money out the window. So the slave codes were really, like I said, to regulate the behavior of the slaves, not necessarily to protect the slaves. And there were some owners who mistreated, but for the most part, no. The worst stories you heard probably did happen, but it was a rarity. And even as your text states, the law on some occasions would take slaves away from, quote, bad owners and put them in jail. It was a rarity also. Usually would be a fine of some kind. But if the slave himself committed a crime, now you've got a problem. How are you going to punish him? Because he doesn't have any property, he doesn't own anything, he can't pay a fine, he doesn't have any money, and if you punish him too much, you're going to lose his labor. So it can be a problem. What are you going to do? So the most common punishment, of course, was whipping. But sometimes you would brand a slave if he was a runaway. Or you might crop his ears so that anyone would see him would know he is in danger of running away. On rare occasions and extreme occasions, if you had a habitual runaway slave, you might cut the tendons in the back of his leg or his Achilles tendon so he could not run. Or you might put heavy weights around him so he couldn't run. But then again, you run into a problem then because you paid good money for this slave. And if you wanted to sell him later on down the road, someone's going to look at him and see he's branded or see his ears cropped or he's got whip marks on his back, and they're not going to want to buy him because he's going to be a worrisome slave, and no one wanted a worrisome slave. But the very best protection that a slave had was the fact of his value economically. Like I said, you're not going to want to spend $700 for a slave and then do something to him so you couldn't get any work out of him at all. That's bad business. Now, I'm not trying to say slavery is right. I'm just trying to get you to look at it from the point of view of the slave owner who truly believed that the black man was inferior at this time. But the economic value of your property or your slave, i.e., was the best protection that the slave had. And we took care of them. We had slave quarters. This is a pen and ink drawing, of course, but it's pretty close to what it was. They would have these little one-room shacks, one-room living quarters. And they'd always be located pretty close to the big house where the boss lived or the white man lived. They had dirt floors, usually no windows, an opening for the door with no door. In the beginning, of course, they do their cooking outside because with no windows or anything, even though you've got the chimney shown on this one for the fireplace, it'd get rather warm in the summertime if you did too much cooking in the house. Now, this is for the field slave. The house slave, of course, lived a lot better because he would be seen by your neighbors coming to visit, so he would eat the same food as the master. He would be given clothes by the master. He would probably bathe more regularly. He would be a much more presentable type person. And we even have cases where in the South, not so much in Kentucky, but in the further deep South, that since your worth financially was determined by the number of slaves, sometimes people would have more slaves in the house than they needed, so that when people came by, they'd say, oh, these people are really rich. Look how many slaves they've got. So you'd have 2 or 3 slaves that would be upstairs maids to clean, and you'd have a couple of cooks, and more than you really needed. But the field slave and the house slave in Kentucky, they lived closer to the master than any other areas of the entire South. Number one, because we didn't own that many, and usually the average slave owner owned a family, a husband and wife and children. They worked together side by side in the fields. They lived really close together. They usually ate the same food. And there was a lot of loyalty to especially the northern Kentucky and western Kentucky slave to the white slave owner. Better the devil you know than when you don't. That's why they didn't run. But also there was that lovely Ohio River. And if they ever got across the Ohio River, of course, they would be into free territory. And that's not good as far as the slave owner. But we had very few runaways, and I'll give you some stats on that pretty soon. But if you had a choice, which of course you did not, but if you had a choice, you would want to be a northern Kentucky slave. Clothing, well, they were issued clothes at birth, and I'll tell you pretty much what they are pretty soon. But whether you were male or female, when you were young, of course, you wore the plain white cotton gown, which isn't that much different from the white children, because I have pictures of my grandfather up to the time he was 3 years old. He didn't have his hair cut, and he wore a long white gown. In wintertime, they would be issued a jacket and shoes, of course, not because the white man really cared, but because if the slave isn't able to work, he's not going to get his money's worth. And of course, they had to last all year long. There wasn't even getting new shoes and new clothes every time you turned around. And of course, we grew hemp, so most of the clothing was made out of a burlap-like material, which is the hemp. Cheap, easy to find, easy to grow. And of course, as I said, the slaves who worked in the big house were the ones given the hand-me-down clothes from the planter's family. And usually it was the female who dressed better. But they'd given 1 pair of shoes and 3 items of underwear a year. And although they were provided by the owner, they were usually ill-fitting, made of that coarse hemp material. And I've found a picture where granted it's a little bit later than the time frame we're studying, but you can see that they're wearing their hair covered up in scarf. And this was a threefold purpose. It kept their hair from getting dirty when they were out in the fields. It protected them a little bit from getting head lice. And in a way, it was a mark of distinction because each plantation had their own style and color of headdress. So what about the people? When you brought them over from Africa, of course, by the 1800s, we're dealing with 3rd and 4th generation native-born or natural increase slaves, not so much regular straight from Africa slaves. But they had oral traditions. They told stories in their homes at night. And they would sing songs, and they kind of blended some of the things that they remembered their parents and grandparents telling them with the new American culture. So they kind of formed their own culture. And, of course, once the revivals were over with, they started building their own churches. And it was in these churches that sometimes they would get a little bit of education, learn how to read and write. Of course, the white man didn't know about it. And, of course, they sang songs, and this is where we had the beginning of the blues and this type thing, singing their woes and worries away. Did we have breeding farms in Kentucky? Oh, there's been stories of this for years. There is no proof. There is no documentation, and I personally don't think it ever happened. We do have documentation of a slave owner in South Carolina who had a breeding farm. He hired only young women under the age of 22, and he encouraged them to have babies. And the irony was that he was a black man, but he was a free black man, forcing women to have sex to have babies to sell as slaves. His idea was women weren't worth anything anyway except to breed babies. But that's a different scenario. That's not Kentucky. Natural increase was viewed as favorable. And if you were a smart young black girl and you was a good-looking young black man around, you would not be opposed to getting, shall we say, friendly with him and producing a child. Because, like I said, the white slave owner was a businessman. You know, if I have a young, healthy slave who is pregnant, I want her to have a healthy baby. Why? It's because I love babies? No. It's because the status of the slave or the child depends upon the status of the mother. If the mother is a slave, that child will be born a slave. Therefore, it's a win-win situation for me as a businessman. I've got a free slave coming along. So if you're smart and played your cards right, you could wind up being pregnant during the harvest time or the planting time, so I wouldn't put you out in the field because I want you just to have a healthy baby. I know it sounds terrible, but sometimes you do crazy things to preserve your own life. If you are free and your husband is a slave, the child is born free. So as I said, the status of the mother determined the status of the child. So we didn't have much breeding per se, but was there a mixing of the races? Of course there was. All you had to do was look out into the yard of any plantation, and you couldn't help but notice that some of the children were of a much lighter colored skin than the others. And you can darn well bet that either the master or the master's son had been doing a little hanky-panky in the slave quarters. Because the female slave had no protection. No protection. She either did what she was told to do by the master or the master's wife, or she would be beaten. As I said, slaves were chattel. Therefore, they could be sold to satisfy the owner's debts on his death, even if they were only partially black. And didn't you read the one in there where the man was living with a mulatto? I think it was Lexington. And actually, she was white-skinned. And then they had children who was only like 1/8 black. They could pass for white anywhere. Went to, they went out of state to school and were living out of state. But when Daddy died, they came back for the funeral. But he hadn't freed them in the will, and that was Kentucky law. If they were not freed in the man's will, they would be sold to satisfy his debts. So both the mulatto who he'd been living with and his white children were classified as black and slaves and sold down the river. Of course, they got a good price for them because here you had educated women who were very light-skinned, and in New Orleans they brought a hefty price, very hefty price. So how did we justify all this? Well, like I said, it was milder in Kentucky because the crops were not so labor-intensive. But then again, slavery's in the Bible. I mean, the patriarchs in the Bible had hundreds of slaves. If it's in the Bible, why is it not all right? The ancient Greeks had slaves, and if they hadn't had slaves, they would have had to do the work and therefore wouldn't have had time to think and give us all of our education and our liberties and our architect and our stories and our, the Greeks gave us a lot. I mean, they introduced us to democracy. So they had time to sit and think because the slaves were doing the work. Of course, the slaves weren't black. Slaves were usually people who had been captured in war or else they could not pay their debts, much as the original slaves in Africa were. Because, taking a side note just a minute, slavery began when black people in Africa would go to war, and, after the killing was over with, whoever won, you had captives. So what do you do with them? You either have to pay someone to take care of them and feed them, or you sell them to other people to use as laborers. And of course, you would really like to keep the chief of the other tribe that you defeated in slavery. But slavery was not looked down upon in Africa. It was a case you lost the war or you couldn't pay your debt. And a lot of times, well, you were able to get free. You became really good friends with the people who owned you. And if you had a child, it was born free. So when the Africans were first introduced to the Portuguese, and the Portuguese needed people to work on their plantations they were starting in Africa, the Africans, in all honesty, did not realize that the white man was going to treat their slaves differently than they had. But in the beginning, it was the black man who was selling black men. And as the business grew and you started making more money, they had to go further inland, and the black men would go into Africa and capture men and bring them out and sell them as slaves. But like I said, the slaves that we're dealing with during this time frame are not slaves that were brought in from Africa or seasoned in the islands. These are slaves that are naturally born here in our state, or we bought them from other states. So the ancient Greeks had slaves. And when we captured this African and took him out of Africa, in reality, well, we gave value to the man, because if he was in Africa, I mean, he ran around, he didn't wear many clothes, he was a heathen, he didn't believe in God, and of course we taught these heathens about Jesus. Made Christians out of them. So we're rescuing them from Africa. And after all, well, we didn't really want slavery. England forced it on us. I mean, granted, it was the Dutch that brought the first slaves into Jamestown, but it was England who had the large slaveholding business. And we all knew that a slave or a black man was not equal to a white man. I mean, the shape of their head is different. They don't speak English. They're not Christian. I mean, well, it's obvious they're not as good as we are. And then we did take care of our slaves. If they were sick or old, we didn't turn them out. Now, those immigrants up north that have to work, the Irish and the Jewish people that come into New York, if you get hurt when you're working on a machine, you get fired. You might even be fined for getting blood on the machine. You're kicked out and you can't work. But in the South, if one of our slaves happens to break a leg or something happens to him working, we don't kick them out. We take care of them. We find them a job to do that they can do with their handicap, or they can take care of the children. We take care of our slaves from the cradle to the death. And, of course, the big kicker. Slavery is protected by not only our state constitution, but by the United States Constitution, because that protects your personal property. And slaves, as I said, are chattel. They are property. I bought and paid for them. They're mine. All good, sound, legal. And, of course, the constitutional amendments protecting private property is very legal. But, of course, there were opponents. Even when we were first becoming a state in the 1792 Constitutional Conventions, it was the ministers who opposed slavery. And then church groups began opposing slavery. And as a matter of fact, in 1821, we actually had a Kentucky Abolition Society formed. Didn't have a lot of members, but Henry Clay was one of the ones who helped found it. We weren't trying to free slaves. What we were going to do was take the slaves who had been freed or were free, or the free blacks, and send them back to Africa. After all, that's where they came from. So we purchased land, and we got up monies to send boatloads back, and I thought it was quite amusing that all the hullabaloo and all the money that was raised, very few actually returned, and some of them actually were sent back over at their behest. They wouldn't even get off the boat. They took one look at that dark, hot land and decided they wanted no part of that. The voyage back over was treacherous. A large percentage of them died on the way back over, and a lot of them just plain didn't want to go. I mean, they weren't born here. Their grandparents were born here. They weren't born in Africa. They didn't want to go to a country they didn't know. At least here, like I say, better the devil you know than one you don't know. But why did we want to do this? Because, plain and simply, out of sight, out of mind. A free black man running around could give my slaves the idea that maybe they could be free. That's not good for my business. Now, there's two words, abolitionist and emancipationist. They both definitely mean freeing of someone in bondage, but they have different meanings. The emancipationist was a person who didn't believe in slavery, who wanted all the slaves freed, but they thought it should be done gradually. You should maybe educate these people, teach them how to read and write, teach them that they've got to pay bills, they've got to make a living and buy their own food. And the slave owner paid a lot of money for them, so maybe we should compensate the slave owner a little bit. So emancipationists wanted gradual freedom, with education for the black man first, and then compensation for the slave owner. But the abolitionists, no. Slavery is wrong. Free the black man now. Do not compensate the white man for contributing to an evil. And sometimes the abolitionists actually encourage violence. They encourage insurrections. In the beginning, they were both pretty much the same, but it didn't take long before the difference in the attitude or the approach to freeing the slaves became quite obvious. That in 1851, Kentucky followed a lot of her southern sisters along and passed a law requiring all free blacks to leave the state. The last thing we wanted was somebody free black wandering around. Now, I'm giving you the names of several people who were emancipationists, or a combination of abolitionists and emancipationists. And Cassius Marcellus Clay is, of course, our most famous abolitionist. He was a Kentuckian from a very wealthy slaveholding family, but he went to Yale to become a student. And while he was there, he was converted. And he began to argue that slavery hindered a state's economic growth. Not necessarily that slavery was morally bad, but it was hindering your economic growth because it victimized the white working class. The poor whites couldn't get a job because the slaves were doing it. He is a piece of work, although he did do a lot of work trying to free slaves outside of Kentucky. He didn't do it inside of Kentucky. He even wrote a pamphlet on Bowie knife fighting, of how when you take a knife, you're not supposed to hold it in your hand up over your head. You hold it down by the side and you thrust upward through a man's stomach. That's the best way to fight with a Bowie knife. He also is reported, and I say reported to have because we have hints. We don't have any real documentation that he knew Abraham Lincoln. He talked to him, but did he give Abraham Lincoln all Lincoln's anti-slavery views? And I thoroughly disagree with that. Lincoln had those well in his mind and formed before he ever met Mr. Clay. He did work to help establish this new Republican Party in the 1850s. But all the things he claimed he did, he established the Republican Party. He's the one that gave Lincoln the anti-slavery views. No. As a matter of fact, Lincoln was working just across the Ohio River in a little Indiana town called Rockport with the son-in-law of a man who helped found Owensboro, or Yellow Banks at the time. And they built a boat and went down the river to New Orleans to sell some things, and there Lincoln saw his first slave auction before he met Mr. Bowie. And he was horrified at what happened at the slave auctions, and that's what turned him against slavery. Prior to that time, I don't think he probably ever met a black man. James Barney, a Kentuckian, he was a former slave owner, and he was for colonization, taking all the free blacks and outside the state, more for emancipation than abolition. But he did turn around and become for abolition later on. And of course, our famous Robert J. Breckinridge, he was an emancipationist and for colonization. He was a true white racist. He thoroughly believed the white man's superior. John C. Young, another Kentuckian, gradual emancipation and education for the black man. Barney and Clay did most of their work outside the state. Young and Breckinridge did a lot of work inside the state, although Breckinridge wasn't that active. His views were very active. He didn't actually do any hard work. But the most famous abolitionist was not from Kentucky. His name was William Lloyd Garrison. He was almost a zealot. He published a newspaper called The Liberator in 1831, became the most outspoken and well-known of all the abolitionists, and he was a dreamer. Oh, man. He wanted world peace. He wanted women to vote. He wanted to end slavery. He wanted a world government. I mean, he had grandiose plans. I don't know what he was smoking, but he was smoking something he shouldn't have been. It wasn't Kentucky tobacco. He actually promoted slave insurrections. He thought that if a wrong was being done, it might take another wrong to eliminate it. There was nothing wrong with a black man killing a white master. He was targeted many times. He had, I guess you would say, a fauteuil against him. Everybody in the South wanted him dead because he was causing big problems. But he caused a lot of dissension between the abolitionists and the emancipationists in the North because he was trying to link women's rights with slavery. He even broke with some of the more well-known anti-slave people in the North because he kept linking this world peace and women voting with freeing the blacks. But like I say, he was not from Kentucky, but of course we did read about him in Kentucky. John G. Fee. I think they spent about a whole column in your text on him. He was born into a slaveholding family, and while he was in college, he was converted. His family was so irritated at him, they cut him off from all funds, and he had to leave school. So he comes to Kentucky, and he begins to build a church. He welcomes everyone, black or white. This was unheard of. He began publishing anti-slavery pamphlets, and he was a true pacifist. He did not believe in carrying weapons. He was very much against violence. But he himself was a target of violence on many, many occasions. He was dragged from the pulpit. He was beaten. And he worked with Henry Clay for a while until differing views on how to combat slavery became too different, because Clay was a pragmatist. He didn't really believe in slavery, but it was the law, and, sometimes you can't fight City Hall. I've got note up here. The last page and a half of this chapter, I'm going to include in chapter 14, the Civil War, because it goes into Lincoln's election and what happens the first few months after the election. So I think we're going to end this chapter right here with page 178.